Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. After weeks of political turmoil, Muhyiddin Yassin resigned today after 17 months as Malaysia's 8th Prime Minister. The 29 members of his Perikatan National Cabinet also tendered their resignations. But until a new Prime Minister is appointed, Muhyiddin will serve as caretaker Prime Minister. Now, how is that role defined by the Constitution? And how does it serve as a guide to the other questions that need to be answered during this period, during the coming weeks? Lawyer Sin Yew joins us now. Sin Yew, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. Now, if I understand correctly, the Federal Constitution doesn't expressly define the authority of a caretaker Prime Minister. Maybe you can begin by explaining what convention says about that role.
Well, the Constitution doesn't even define or provide for a caretaker Prime Minister. So this term, a caretaker Prime Minister, it is more of a political term rather than a legal term. I'll try to, cut short on the jargons tonight. But under Article 43, it only provides for a Prime Minister. So you're either a Prime Minister or you're not a Prime Minister. There's no in-betweens. So when we say that Muhyiddin is still is a caretaker Prime Minister, it simply means that he is still Prime Minister, but there is an understanding that he is only holding that role and he will resign once a new Prime Minister is found. And to answer your question, what are the conventions behind caretaker Prime Minister? Well, if you are a caretaker Prime Minister, you can exercise all the powers and functions of a Prime Minister. There is no meaningful difference between a Prime Minister and a caretaker Prime Minister, save that the latter is bound by convention to not make any major decisions, such as any decisions that could have a significant policy impact or enter into major government contracts.
Sin Yew, we heard from Muhyiddin Yassin, after his announcement that he resigned, or had resigned rather, and in which he pretty much said that he's not even going to go to the office because it's not his office. So he is clearly aware of the limitations that are placed on him. Are there any checks on the caretaker Prime Minister, legal checks or constitutional checks for people who maybe in the atmosphere of a trust deficit might fear that he might misuse his position?
Well, this is where the Constitution doesn't provide for any checks. So any checks that there are there, it would be checks that would normally be on a Prime Minister. And as we know it, as we have seen it for the past 2 years or so, there isn't very much. Parliament is supposed to act as a check, but Parliament is not sitting. And I can't imagine a situation where the caretaker Prime Minister remains in position until Parliament convenes again in September. That's almost a month away. So that would take a very long time because this position, it's meant to be a temporary position until a new candidate is found. So
right.
That
Sin Yew, on that note, yeah. I mean, temporary is subjective, right? As soon as possible seems to be subjective to some people. Can I understand? Can you explain how to define this interim period? How long is a caretaker period? How long is too long?
1 day is too long, I would think, because the political parties, they have to find common ground and they really have to decide among themselves, or at least by a majority, who should be the next Prime Minister. The fact that we have a situation where there is no clear majority puts the Yang di-Pertuan Agong in a very awkward position because the Yang di-Pertuan Agong is not supposed to be involved in politics, is not supposed to play the role of an umpire. It is up to the political parties to decide among themselves who should lead and present that name to the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. So what had happened, if we could recall back in February 2020, that was actually not good practice, because the Yang di-Pertuan had to interview all the MPs before he could appoint a new Prime Minister. That shouldn't be the case. So how long is too long? That really isn't a question that I can answer. I would think 1 day is too long. I would think there should be an immediate successor. But it's really up to the parliamentarians at this point.
Right. Sin Yew, considering that we're very fractious politics and this government has fallen precisely because of a lack of understanding or a coalition that could not hold together, what happens with the 6th of September Parliament meeting if it were to be brought forward in order to legitimize or ratify, a new Prime Minister, so that he does in fact have, or he or she does in fact have the support of the House? How is it done? Who brings forward such a parliamentary meeting?
So, Muhyiddin is still the Prime Minister. If he wants to bring forward the parliamentary meeting, he can. So he would exercise all the powers the Prime Minister would normally have. But what I would think should happen is that before the 6th of September parliamentary sitting, the Yang di-Pertuan Agong would appoint a new Prime Minister, whoever that may be, and then test his confidence during the King's speech. If the King's speech is not passed, then by convention, that person ceases to command confidence or majority and should resign. Now, who this person is going to be the all-important question, because under Article 43, sub 2, it says that the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, in his judgment, appoints someone who is likely to command confidence of the majority. So that leaves room for someone who does not command confidence of the majority, i.e. 111 members of parliament, to be appointed as a Prime Minister. And that it's up to that person to then either negotiate a supply and confidence agreement with the other parties and ensure that the King's speech is passed. If that person doesn't, then like what I've mentioned earlier, that person would have to resign, and then the process begins all over again.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Sin Yew, for helping us understand a little bit better the constitutionality behind what to expect in the coming days and weeks. Thank you for your time. We're going to take a quick break, but after this, we'll speak to analysts for their take on the political developments. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Self-lockdown itu penting. Lebih kurang pergerakan, maka lebih sukar untuk COVID menjangkit kita.
Untuk tempoh 2 minggu ini, duduk di rumah. Kalau kita boleh laksanakan KKP, Kendiri dan keluarga,
saya kira insyaAllah kita boleh berjaya. Akhirnya kita menang.
Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Tonight we're discussing what happens next following the resignation of Muhyiddin Yassin, as there appears to be no clear candidate to succeed him as Prime Minister. Trisha Yeoh joins us now. She is the CEO of the think tank Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or better known as Ideas. Trisha, good evening. Thank you for being on the show tonight. Now, we just heard from a Sin Yew lawyer who outlined that, in fact, there is no real distinction between caretaker prime minister and prime minister in terms of powers and functions. They have the same, they can exercise the same powers and functions. I'm just wondering, for you in particular, are there concerns you might have during this interim period about the oversight onto what a caretaker prime minister can and cannot do?
Hi, Melissa. Thanks for having me. Yes, so Ideas issued a statement today in which we asked for greater clarity as to the timing, right? So the palace statement actually did not indicate anything at all about what are the next steps, apart from just saying that Tan Sri Muhyiddin will be the caretaker prime minister until the new government is formed. We don't know what the process will look like, although the constitution has some indication, but we don't know exactly what the king would like to do in this instance. We also said in our statement that the caretaker prime minister should not announce any major new policies, as well as announce anything that would involve major public spending. This is the same case that we would have said if Parliament had dissolved and there would have been a caretaker government in that space and time. The reason behind this is essentially that you don't want the next government that's coming in to have to implement something that only a caretaker government was making a decision over. So they're not mandated to do that.
Right, Trisha. It seems that we were here at this spot only 17 months ago. And already we have reports that the palace has invited Pejuang, UMNO, DAP tomorrow to have an audience with the monarch. The issue underscoring the political crisis, has that gone away, or do you think that we are in for a long haul with regard to resolving the tensions between the different factions in Parliament?
Oh, definitely. I think we have to prepare ourselves. We have to brace ourselves for a very long period of uncertainty. I don't think this political impasse or crisis, whatever you want to call it, will be resolved all the way until the general election takes place. So, we're looking at least, hopefully not for almost 1 year of instability, because even if the king is secured, that he is convinced that a certain one member of parliament can convene the majority of the House. This will be a very, very slim majority. The same probably will get back into the same situation as before. And whatever confidence and supply agreement that is cobbled together as well over the next 3 weeks. So just remember that we have 3 weeks until the 7th of September when Parliament does convene. Unless a government can be formed at that point in time, then, of course, we want to see this happening in the House itself, which would actually be the most democratic way to do it. But my point is that whichever government is formed between now and election, I believe will still have to contend with possible crossovers and instability. So let's just hope for the general election to be able to take place soon.
Trisha, that is very disconcerting to think that this uncertainty could continue this could be a long haul period. What concerns do you have about the impacts of that on the leadership of the National Immunization Program, the National Recovery Plan? Are you worried about how this could impact public policy?
Yes, of course, great concern. So in our statement, we also talked about the need for whichever government that's coming into place to ensure these two programs are continuing to be rolled out. I think the National Immunization Program, or PIC, has done a very fantastic job, and this should be allowed to carry on. So in the interim period, the civil servants should be empowered to carry that out. The National Recovery Plan as well, alongside the National Recovery Council, all of that should continue because there are very, very good, technocrats and professionals that have been brought in that will need to stay the course, because right now, what's the priority? The priority is to manage the pandemic, and we can see already that the patterns in the Klang Valley are starting to replicate outside of the Klang Valley. And let's remember that the healthcare facilities in the other states are not as sophisticated, as well as vaccination rates are still low. So, yeah, I would agree that it's imperative that these programs maintain.
Tricia, the palace statement also noted that this was not a right time for an election. It didn't say whether the former Prime Minister, Muhyiddin Yassin, had in fact asked for a dissolution of Parliament as part of a kind of resolution of the crisis. But what we do know is the palace is of the opinion that an election is not viable at this point in time. But considering the nature of the pandemic, shouldn't we think about the possibility of an election, in the near future, even if the pandemic has not, as it were, ended?
I think right now it's actually very dangerous to do that. I mean, our public healthcare system just does not have the right facilities to support that. I would probably take a different opinion if the ICUs were not in such a critical state in the Klang Valley and elsewhere. Once it's a little bit more manageable, then perhaps that could be a possibility. But I also think that we need to be a little bit more creative and imaginative in finding solutions. No one's really talked about having, we talk about hybrid parliament, but, can we do a hybrid election? Can we have electronic voting? I mean, these are the things that the Election Commission should already be thinking about exploring actively and putting it out in the public for public discussion, because you're right, what if there are new variants of concern that emerge? Does this mean that we're going to delay the election for another year, another 2 years? And what will that make our economy? I think that's also the greatest concern here. I'm very worried that the message that Malaysia is sending to the international community is that Malaysia is closed for business. And what we're saying is, we're going to only open for business once the election takes place. And we cannot continue this way. I mean, there's so many things that are stalled. Investors and the private sector, they themselves are put in a spot because they don't know whether to channel more funds into the country or not. So this is really one of the worst impacts, I would say, of the entire last 1.5 years.
Tricia, thank you so much for joining us on the show. That was Tricia Yew of Ideas. We're going to take another quick break. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned.
Check this out.
Lebih kurang pergerakan, maka lebih sukar untuk COVID menjangkit kita.
Untuk tempoh 2 minggu ini, duduk di rumah. Kalau kita boleh laksanakan KKP Kendiri dan keluarga,
saya kira insyaAllah kita boleh berjaya. Akhirnya kita menang.
Amanah di tangan kita.
Hi, thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. We're discussing what might happen next following Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin and his cabinet's resignation today. What realignments can we expect, and how will parties like Bersatu need to reposition themselves? Let's ask Yassin. He's a senior fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and he joins us today on his birthday. Thank you for sharing your birthday with us, Yassin. Let's take a quick look at how the resignation of Muhyiddin Yassin might impact his party specifically. I mean, where do you think Bersatu will likely go from here? I mean, can it accept a subservient position to UMNO?
Well, if Bersatu were to keep its status within a ruling coalition, it would almost have to be subservient to UMNO, because right now within Bersatu, there doesn't seem to be another, shall we say, commanding figure who could, for example, still keep the party in a leadership position within this ruling coalition. If they still want to keep this ruling coalition intact, then UMNO would have to be in charge. But you already see that, right? I mean, you already see it's almost like everybody for himself now within Bersatu. There are rumors of various figures trying to jostle for new cabinet positions within an UMNO-led government, for example. Yeah.
Isan, from the very beginning, Bersatu, as it hitched its start to the Pakatan Harapan movement, had a dilemma. It had to build itself, and it built itself with a lot of crossovers from UMNO. Do you think that bad blood will go away? That UMNO and Bersatu will be reconciled as parties that can coexist? Because essentially, they're fighting for the same turf, aren't they?
Well, of course, politics is always a marriage of convenience. If they would like to keep the current ruling coalition intact and not form new ones, then, well, they have to somehow accommodate each other, right? Bersatu, as you rightly pointed out, hitched on the Pakatan and won a number of seats under the Pakatan ticket, but they never had quite a large and established grassroots systems as with UMNO. So if they were to come out against UMNO, let's say in some sort of an election, it is very likely that they will be defeated by UMNO. So in that case, unless Bersatu suddenly would like to make a huge change of mind and heart and join back Pakatan Harapan and be content with, perhaps a backbencher type of status, well, then they would have to give in to, they would have to give in to UMNO and take a back seat in terms of leading the ruling coalition. Yes.
Well, okay. So let's take a look at some of the likely permutations and the combinations that we have to consider, given that no one has a clear majority as yet. I mean, what do you think, Yassin, is the likelihood of this unity government, of a formation of a unity government held together by a confidence and supply agreement? And what pros and cons do you see of that?
Well, a unity government is very nice, it's very grand, especially if it is led by me and not you, right? I think that is indeed the problem now. I think everybody likes the idea of a unity government, but they would like the government to be led by themselves and not somebody else. Well, then you are back to square one, isn't it? And I think at the moment, we simply do not have, shall we say, some sort of collective mood for it. I mean, even though our pandemic situation is extremely serious and the economy is on a downward spiral, it doesn't seem like all these politicians are really worried about that and say, oh, we really have to save this country. Let's put our, differences aside and so on. If anything, it intensifies the fight for jostling for powers and so on. And therefore, I frankly do not see a realistic chance for this unity government to take shape. Yeah.
So, Isan, the public mood, let's talk a little bit about that, because what has been, in some sense, a marginal argument about the need to sort of bypass Parliament, have a Mageran-style, government, an emergency government where the emergency powers it's insulated from parliamentary pressures. That all assumes that the monarch will go along with it. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the role of the palace and the monarch. I mean, do you see that, or what would, as it were, need to happen for the monarch to actually play a much more activist role in the politics of the day?
Well, I think our current monarch is already taking a very proactive role in our, shall we say, governance and political structure. And that was almost by necessity because the previous administration, I mean the Muhyiddin regime, has been relentless in its almost direct assault on the bounds of our constitution, whether written or unwritten. So the king is a very meticulous and very cautious person, and therefore he did a lot of things also within the bounds of the constitution, but trying to, in a sense, sort of improve the situation a bit after Muhyiddin sometimes would bundle one constitutional provisions after another. So we are already seeing that happening. I think what needs to be taking place in future as a more stable government comes in, and I think there's a bipartisan consensus on this, multi-partisan consensus on this, that we need to push through some constitutional amendments such that the role of, for example, the Prime Minister, the Parliament, the monarch, and so on, could be more clearly defined. Then there will be less room for various maneuvering and less needs for His Majesty to really becoming more proactive again. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yassin, for your time tonight. Appreciate you joining us. That was political analyst Yassin. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.